I'm Nick Torrey. I'm an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I've been working on coal ash since 2011, when I graduated from law school, came back to my hometown in Chapel Hill to work at the Southern Environmental Law Center. And I'm going to tell you about what we've been up to, how we're getting coal ash sites cleaned up in the region, and actually provide a little more of a non-scientific context for some of the sites that you've actually just heard about in the previous presentation. Why we got involved in these issues, obviously we've heard a lot about the different concerns, but coal ash is the second largest source of industrial waste in the United States, and it's the largest source of toxic water pollution. As you've heard, it contains all kinds of toxic pollutants: arsenic, lead, mercury, hexavalent chromium, thallium, which used to be, I learned, used in rat poison, but it had to be banned because it was actually too toxic, and many others. It's stored in massively large, unlined earthen pits that leak, and the power plants historically are located on the banks of rivers and lakes because they needed cooling water. And of course, the easiest thing to do is to just dig your massive, unlined, leaking pit right on the bank of the river to dump the coal ash into, and that's what was done for decades. Or frequently, you'll have stream valleys that were dammed up and coal ash was dumped into them. If you contrast the way that this industrial waste containing a lot of toxic pollutants is stored with the way that even household garbage is stored today, it's sort of mind-boggling. Our coal ash guru and my colleague Frank Holloman, who's our sort of senior litigator on these cases, has made the point that you would never be able to store Kleenex and banana peels the way that you store coal ash in the United States. So it's a major concern for all those reasons, but this is really what I think most people think of when they think of coal ash, and certainly was the thing that first brought it to my attention, the Kingston TVA coal ash spill in 2008. The possibility of these kinds of catastrophic failures is another major, obviously environmental and public health concern with the storage of coal ash. And unfortunately, these coal ash spills are not uncommon. One thing we've learned by digging into the documents is that at Duke Energy's coal ash sites in North Carolina, for example, there have been a number of small coal ash spills over the years, in addition to large coal ash spill at the Dan River site in 2014. This is the site after the wastewater and a significant amount of coal ash spilled out into the Dan River, which of course contaminated about 70 miles of the river, caused drinking water restrictions, fish consumption restrictions. People were actually told they couldn't even touch the water, and this went on for months, causing a lot of economic and reputational concerns for tourism in the region, et cetera, as well as agriculture, and of course just disrupting everyone's lives. This is another coal ash spill site that illustrates another aspect of the problem. When these massive coal ash pits are filled in stream valleys, the stream doesn't go away. It's still down there, and it can cause stability problems. So this was such a site. This is actually in Wisconsin on the shore of Lake Michigan, and there's Lake Michigan right there. And this site illustrates, I think, one problem with what Duke Energy wants to do with its coal ash sites, which is to simply put a cap on top of them. This site was essentially capped by being paved over with an industrial site, part of this power plant. You would never know there was coal ash under here. But the buried stream was still there, and coal ash is not a stable material, and under those conditions, you can have a spontaneous spill, essentially, and that's exactly what happened here. One day in 2011, we got this right into Lake Michigan without any warning. These are tractor trailers, sort of to give you an idea of the scale. So I think this illustrates the problem with simply covering up the coal ash as opposed to cleaning it up, which is what we and our clients have been advocating for throughout the region, moving the coal ash into modern dry-lined landfill storage or recycling for concrete in order to get it out of the groundwater, away from the surface waters where it's leaching these pollutants. So there's another aspect to it, of course, which is that on an everyday basis, you have essentially a slow-motion coal ash spill happening at all of these sites throughout the state. They are leaching pollutants into the groundwater, as we've heard, and they also leak streams of contaminated wastewater out of their sides. And those carry, of course, the pollutants down into the waters. This is at the H.F. Lee site in Goldsboro, but it's happening at all of these sites throughout the state. And there's different aspects to the problem. So there's sort of direct pollution, and then there's also a problem that we've encountered, for example, at the Belews Creek site, where one of the pollutants that's being leaked out into actually the Dan River, upstream of where the spill took place, is bromide, and when that flows downstream to water treatment plants for the drinking water systems in Eden, where the spill took place, and other towns near there, they treat their water with chlorine, and that causes the formation of trihalomethanes, which are a very concerning pollutant that is thought to be carcinogenic. And so there are those sort of secondary problems as well, and that's one that Duke Energy has not cleaned up that site. That's an ongoing problem. As part of a criminal plea agreement that Duke Energy had to sign, they have given some money to these towns to upgrade their water systems to try to better treat the water, but Duke has not stopped the discharge of the bromide. So it's an ongoing problem I think they've not been able to fully eliminate so far. So all of this is going on, and this is back in 2011. We knew that there was federal coal ash rule on the horizon that was being worked on, had been worked on for a long time. We're very lucky to have Lisa Evans here, who's probably the world's leading expert in the world on the rule. But we wanted to get started targeting particular sites that we knew had serious ongoing pollution problems. So we started bringing cases in South Carolina, had a lot of success there, and then came to North Carolina. Now the problem is region-wide, I should say, and you've seen a version of this map already, but this shows the river systems, and you can see that virtually every major river system in the southeast has these coal ash impoundments on them. But so one of the first sites that we started working on was this one, and you've heard a little bit about it from the selenium perspective, but this is Mountain Island Lake. This is a picture of Mountain Island Lake. And the problem with it is that it is the drinking water supply for the entire Charlotte metropolitan region, which is about 1 million people. Duke Energy's Riverbend coal ash lagoons are perched right on top of Mountain Island Lake, and they discharge into the lake just upstream, as is illustrated in the photograph here, of the drinking water intake for the entire Charlotte metropolitan area. So Professor Vengosh and his team have done studies here and found very high levels of arsenic and other pollutants in the sediments at the bottom of the lake, and actually explained that it can, under the right dissolved oxygen conditions, it can actually erupt up into the surface water column as well. So this is a major concern, and of course, this is sort of a vertigo-inducing picture, but there's obviously a major spill risk at this site because these are 80-foot high dams sort of perched right above the drinking water reservoir there in the background. These are the Riverbend coal ash lagoons. So for all of these reasons, the community was very concerned, we were very concerned, and Duke fought us for years on this site, but eventually we were able to secure binding agreements to get this site excavated and cleaned up, and that is happening today. Another site that we looked at early on and have had success getting cleaned up is the Sutton site, and we've also heard about this one a little bit. Here's a little more context on it. This is Sutton Lake. And it is a popular fishing lake. As you've heard, this is actually managed by the Wildlife Resources Commission. People are encouraged to fish there. It's a popular recreational fishing destination, but also it's important for subsistence fishers in the area who feed their families from this lake. And it was allowed by the state of North Carolina for years to be used as part of Duke Energy's private coal ash wastewater system, even though it's a public fishing lake. It was created to provide cooling water for the power plant, but at the same time, when it was created by easement by the state, it was designated as a public fishing lake. And yet, over the years, the state had allowed it to be used to dump coal ash waste into untreated with no water quality protections. It was treated as Duke Energy's private dumping ground. Here's a deformed fish, which is the result of the selenium poisoning. And as you've heard, there was a study done that looked at the effects of coal ash pollution in this lake and found pervasive problems with the fish population, deformities, and many, many millions of fish being actually killed over the years as a result of the contamination. Now, that's one problem at the Sutton site that's very concerning. There was actually another one as well. Here's the coal ash impoundments at Sutton. As you can see, they're right on the banks of Sutton Lake and discharged into it. The other problem, however, is that was on the other side of the coal ash lagoons here. In about this location, there are a number of community water supply wells that supply a nearby community called Flemington. And there is a plume of coal ash contamination in the groundwater migrating and heading straight for the community drinking wells, containing high levels of boron, arsenic, and other things. Now, this is something that no one was paying attention to when we got involved. Duke Energy actually, on some of its filings with the state, labeled these water supply wells as non-potable wells, and it was just something that no one was focusing on, even though the contamination was already, reaching Duke Energy's property line, spreading beyond it. So when we started putting the pieces together and figuring this out by digging through the documents, we were able to, get some public attention on the problem, and as a result, Duke Energy is now has had to install a water line to provide municipal water to this community to protect them from the coal ash contamination of the groundwater at this site. It's very sandy soil, very shallow groundwater, and there's this rapidly expanding plume of contamination threatening the water supply wells. So fortunately, we were able to get some public attention on that and get clean water to these folks. This is another site that's now being excavated. Excavation is well underway, and they're going to move the ash all into dry-lined landfill storage as well. Here's another health issue. It's sort of a public health policy issue that we stumbled into as part of our coal ash litigation. After the Dan River spill, there was a coal ash law passed, and it mandated testing of residential wells, water supply wells, around coal ash lagoons in North Carolina. And one of the substances that they tested for was hexavalent chromium. There's not a state groundwater standard for hexavalent chromium, and so the State Department of Environmental Quality and also the Department of Health and Human Services got together, and they applied a formula that's written into the state groundwater regulations to calculate a health screening level, which is what you do in these situations, to figure out, well, what is the what level of hexavalent chromium is going to give you an increased cancer risk of 1 in a million. That's what the formula says. So they did that calculation. Everybody agreed on it. They checked it with the CDC. And the residential well results came back, and a lot of people had levels of hexavalent chromium that were higher than this level. So the Department of Health and Human Services in those situations sends out recommendations to people not to drink or cook with their water because of the increased cancer risk. And that's what they did. Now, there was also a language in those warning letters that went out that said, by the way, don't drink and cook with your water, but it meets all federal safe drinking water standards. So this was a little confusing for people. I'll explain more about that in a minute. The next thing that happened was rather surprising. This past spring, the state actually decided to reverse itself and pull back those do not drink letters. They issued instead do drink letters saying, we've changed our minds and your 1 in a million is really not that big a deal. The level of pollution in your water is the same, but we're not going to tell you that you shouldn't drink it. You can go ahead and drink it anyway. So this was confusing and concerning to people as well. As part of our litigation, we've deposed a number of the scientists and officials who were involved in this whole situation. And a number of things emerged from their testimony that were, I think, important for people to learn about. One thing that emerged from the testimony is that state scientists in the Department of Health and Human Services considered that language in the original warning letters about federal standards to be highly misleading because there are no federal standards for hexavalent chromium. And so when it said your water meets all federal standards, it was really a meaningless and almost the opposite of the truth because in fact, there was no standard in place there, and they had these high levels in their water. Another thing that emerged was that the decision to pull back the do not drink letters and issue the do drink letters was made not for purely health policy reasons. There were a lot of political concerns by non-scientist political officials in state government that were involved. Duke Energy was involved in pushing back on some of these policies. And so all of that context was very important, I think, to bring out, because as people were trying to make decisions for their families and their children about what to do, they needed to have all the information. After a lot of this information came out, the state epidemiologist actually resigned in protest because she said in a statement she could not work for an agency that was deliberately misleading the public. And so this was obviously a major issue of public concern. Finally, there's one other sort of chapter to this that was unexpected and came out of our litigation and these depositions that we took. When the state told people it was okay to drink their water, one thing that we learned is that the health screening level was still valid and still in place. Nothing had changed except a policy decision by the political officials. And that was one reason why the scientists were very concerned. After issuing the original do not drink letters and then issuing the do drink letters, the state health director told us in a deposition that he had actually changed his mind again and had decided that they should be telling people, actually, do not drink your water if you have very high levels of hexavalent chromium, higher than 10 parts per billion. And that he was going to have his department that day reach out to people who had these high levels of hexavalent chromium and again warn them not to drink or cook with their water, even though just a few months before they'd gotten the message that they could and should do those things. So we took that deposition, but it turned out that this never happened. These people were not warned about their water again for weeks afterwards. And only when the deposition testimony came out and some reporters started following up with the Department of Health and Human Services did eventually, weeks later, those warnings go out to people. So I think, again, this illustrates the importance of bringing transparency and sort of sunshine to some of these public health issues so that people can have all the information and make informed decisions to try to protect their families. So I've got two sort of happy stories to close with. One is this one, which is the Buck coal ash site in Salisbury, North Carolina. This is one of the ones where people got a lot of these warning letters and where a lot of the concern was concentrated. And also, whoa, that was loud. And also, this is a site where there's a lot of concern about contamination of the Yadkin River. And we have the Yadkin River Keeper here. There had been a lot of sampling and identification of leaking streams of contaminated wastewater going into the Yadkin River containing high levels of arsenic and other pollutants. So this is a site that we'd been fighting to get cleaned up for many years. Duke Energy fought us all the way. And of course, this was also a concern for residents, many of whom had houses located very close to the coal ash lagoons. Fortunately, about a month ago, we were able to secure a deal with Duke for them to fully excavate all the coal ash lagoons at this site. All the ash is going to be excavated and either stored in dry line landfill storage, or actually their plan is to recycle it for concrete. And I'm happy to talk about that maybe in the question period, but that is a very good thing. So that's one happy story. And this is another happy story. As I mentioned at the beginning, we started our work on coal ash in South Carolina, and we got a number of legal victories that led to cleanups of coal ash sites in South Carolina, and now actually every utility in South Carolina is excavating every one of its riverfront coal ash lagoons. So that's a major victory and means that South Carolina is really ahead of everywhere else in the United States on coal ash. The first site that we ever worked on was the Wateree site, which is operated by the utility SCE&G. It's on the Wateree River, which is just the Catawba River in South Carolina. And it's just upstream of the Congaree National Park. We started working on the case early on. We were able to get a binding commitment from the utility to excavate all the coal ash to an on-site lined landfill that they had further back from the river. So they've been now pulling the ash back from the river and putting it into dry line storage now for about 4 years. And what we've seen in that time is that the groundwater quality has really improved dramatically as they get the source of that contamination out of the groundwater. So arsenic levels have dropped by as much as 90% along the Wateree River, and it's been a big success story for the utility. They're very proud of their work there. They've gotten a lot of great press. And it's also a story that's been repeated elsewhere. So the next site we worked on in South Carolina was a site near Myrtle Beach, operated by a different utility, Santee Cooper. They've now been excavating their coal ash for several years now and have seen the same thing. They had high arsenic contamination in the groundwater. It's fallen off precipitously as they have been removing the coal ash from those unlined impoundments. So I think this really illustrates that even though this is a very large problem, there are common sense solutions that are actually working today. So we're very optimistic about the future. Duke has agreed, as of now, Duke Energy has agreed to clean up 10 out of its 16 coal ash sites that it has in the 2 Carolinas. And we at the Southern Environmental Law Center and our clients are obviously continuing to fight to protect public waters at the remaining 6 sites. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
I'm just wondering if Duke Energy is releasing any more effluent into lakes, and if it's permitted for them to do so, and if it is permitted, if the standards are considered good for the permits.
Okay. So it's really a mixed bag. They definitely are still discharging into lakes at the sites that are being cleaned up. You have situation where basically they have this residual wastewater that they have to get rid of in order to excavate the ash. And at some sites, we've been able to get good pollutant limits on that discharge. So at Sutton Lake, for example, they're treating the water, and it's actually pretty reasonable limits. Now that lake has been recognized as subject to the Clean Water Act, there's actually good, that's as a result of the case that we won, there's now actually pretty decent pollution limits on the discharge into it. At other lakes, however, that's not the case. And so, for example, you heard about Mayo Lake earlier. There are very inadequate limits on pollution going into Mayo Lake, and the new permits that the state is currently proposing are very inadequate in terms of the amount of just the total lack of limits, really, for the toxic pollutants that everyone here is concerned about going into that lake. All these lakes are going to be, all the coal ash impoundments are going to be pumped out, whether or not there's yet an excavation commitment. They're all going to be pumped out. And so you're going to have not just the water coming from the top of the lagoon after the pollutants have settled down, but actually all the way down to the water that's sort of has been saturating the coal ash for years. And so it can be highly toxic. And it's really different from the normal operation in the past of these coal ash lagoons. And yet, in too many cases, the permits that are in place or have been proposed by the state don't contain the same kind of limits that are very much achievable. The technology is there, but they're not being, Duke Energy is not being required to treat that wastewater.
This is probably a little bit of a naive question, but when you're interacting with Duke, do they have, first of all, their own scientific staff, and do they understand their issues? I mean, I know it comes across a little bit strangely, but, and are they in denial and saying, well, or it's within the regulatory environment? What's the culture that you're encountering as more and more evidence is just coming clear in the PR costs and so on?
Let's see. How much time do I have? It's been an evolving process, I think. They obviously, this is something that was really not paid attention to for years. They've now had to pay attention to it as a result of our efforts, as a result of the Dan River spill, as a result of new regulations. And so there is more studying happening. Whether the sort of fundamental problems are being really considered would be hard for me to say. So there's a lot of things still to be resolved. Chief among them that the coal ash is at many of the sites where Duke Energy wants to leave it in place. It's sitting deep in the groundwater. And when I say deep, I mean 60, 70, even 80 feet below the water table. So you have millions of tons of coal ash sitting in the groundwater, where it can leach out pollutants even after you put a cap on top. That's a major problem, and it's one that Duke has not yet confronted.